Marilyn Robinson, who's one of my favorite writers, as some of y'all already know because I talk about her a lot. Marilyn Robinson writes, I think the basis of democracy is the willingness to assume well about other people. Well, I'm going to be honest with y'all. I am not doing that great at that these days for a host of reasons. I mean, we could start with the fact that just this very morning, the President of the United States tweeted a video, complimented it, that starts out praising and calling for white supremacy. I mean, right there, I'm struggling with assuming well about other people. And we've seen the rise and the return in places where people aren't wearing masks or aren't being told to wear masks, or they're going out to bars and, just doing all sorts of things. None of those things are wrong or sinful or terrible on their own, but in the context of this virus and this moment in which we live, they're problematic, to say the least. So if I am supposed to have a willingness to think well of all other people on the daily, my first thought this morning is I need to confess to you that I'm not always doing so great at that right now. But I think part of the reason we sometimes struggle to think well of other people is we know ourselves well enough to know that they, like us, are very often wildly imperfect. Wildly imperfect. We see ourselves and one another in the text from the 3rd chapter of Genesis that we've read this morning. And so we're inclined to know sometimes we don't act as we ought. We're inclined to see evidence all around of people who are not acting in good faith or who are behaving selfishly. I think that's actually what's at the core of this text. I think you hear from the man and the woman in this text a lot of reasons why they did what they did. It was attractive. It was interesting. It seemed like a good idea at the time. When God asks them why they had done that thing that they should not have done, their response is, it's because somebody else made me do it, tricked me into doing it. It was the woman, it was the snake, it was somebody else's fault. And I have to imagine that all of that rings true to all of us for at least some of the moments in our lives when we have done the thing we ought not to have done, that we knew wasn't particularly helpful, that we knew wasn't particularly kind, that we knew might actually hurt somebody. Really what Adam and Eve, the man and the woman, are saying here to my mind is that they did it because they felt like it, which is very often why many of us do that thing we oughtn't do, because we felt like it. We orient so much of our lives around ourselves, around our own needs and desires. And that seems to me to be the part of this text that I recognize, that resonates, that I see myself in. Those moments when I have been selfish and self-centered. Those moments when I did something that I thought I could come up with good reasons for, but the truth of the matter was it just felt like it. Where I'd forgotten for half a second that I was not the center of the universe or the point of it all. Paul writes quite eloquently of this experience in the letter to the Romans when he says, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. That is familiar, is it not? I do the thing I don't want to do, I don't intend to do. I know I shouldn't do. And I don't do that thing that I want to do, at least part of me wants to do. I don't do that thing that I know would be helpful. You know, for some people, that thing that they don't want to do, that they do anyway, is picking up a bottle or a needle. For some folks, it is saying something unhelpful and profoundly hurtful. For some folks, it's walking out a door that they can't come back in. But we find ourselves in those moments where we have done the thing that we knew we shouldn't have done. There's all sorts of ways we might phrase that for ourselves that would be particularly descriptive of those experiences we've had in our own lives. But surely all of us know what it means to do the thing at least part of you doesn't want to do, and to not do the thing that at least part of you wants to do and wishes you had done. And these are the struggles of being human and figuring out our way. And these are the struggles that speak to our ability to really muck things up, you know, to get it wrong, to mess up, to flail and fail at the things that really mean a lot to us, but we just can't seem to set ourselves aside long enough to do right. Now, none of us are like that all the time, but sometimes. Sometimes we find ourselves struggling with, and there's no better word for it, sin. Sometimes we find ourselves struggling with sin because we are, all of us, wildly imperfect. Wildly imperfect. And when those impulses and moments multiply, we end up with violence and brutality. When we forget who we want to be long enough, we become unkind and thoughtless and even cruel. And at the core of it, it seems to me, is this selfishness, this inability to set ourselves aside, this forgetting that we need God and one another, forgetting that we are not, in fact, the center of the universe. And when we are selfish in that way, because I felt like it or because I wanted to, becomes a justification for things that we do, even if they hurt or harm someone else. When we forget that we're dependent upon God and dependent upon one another, it leads to a self-centeredness and a disregard for others, a flagrant disregard for others. We forget that other people are even supposed to be part of the equation we utilize to get us through this life. And so we end up having mucked up some good things in our lives. Daniel Migliore, who's a theologian, says that sin is the great refusal to live thankfully and gladly by the grace of God that makes personal life and community with diverse others possible. Now, this is much more complicated and requires a lot more thought and evaluation in terms of trying to figure out who and how we want to be in the world than the way the church has too often gone, which is to simply describe sin as some violation of a moral code. Here are the things you're allowed to do. Here are the things you're not allowed to do. Do these, you're good. Do these, you're sinning. You know, that is an easy out that doesn't really speak to the life we're called to live in relationship and in community. We need God and we need one another. And I'd like to suggest this morning is sin is forgetting and rejecting that truth and living as if what we want and what we feel like is the be all and end all of how we act and function and go about our lives. The lie the world tells us is that our self-gratification is what matters above all else, and that we don't have to think about how what we do impacts others and how the rules that we make for one another harm others. The good news in this is that we are changeable beings. We can grow and do better and be better. Perhaps that's where we might find the willingness to think well of one another, is to remember that we don't have to be stuck with the world we have. And we don't have to be stuck with the person we are right now when who we are has hurt another person or harmed a relationship. We sometimes like to be stuck because then we'd have an excuse for not getting and being better. But we are changeable beings. We can change. Now, I know this is true because just a few years ago this week, Obergefell came down from the Supreme Court, and seemingly much more quickly than I'd expected it to happen, we became a more gracious, more inclusive, more decent society. We collectively created the space for justice so that people could love who they loved and marry who they loved and have equal access to the laws. Now, you know, that's really, really important to remember the joy at that event, but also to remember that those rights are, as we speak, under threat. So I don't want to make light of that, but I do want to speak to our capacity to be better and to do better. And just last year, I got to sit on a fire escape above Christopher Street and watch hours and hours and hours of the celebration of Pride on this Sunday last year with friends who, when we were growing up, could not have imagined such a day was possible. We can be better, and we can do better, and we have the capacity to grow and to become kinder and more loving and more accepting of one another. And that's a remarkable thing and a remarkable gift, and we should never, ever forget it or make light of the potential that exists within us collectively to grow and to change. We're not stuck with the world that we have, and we're not stuck with who we are in the ways we're not who we want to be. most of the time, I think most of us are pretty great. And most of us are trying to be good and trying to be thoughtful and trying to be kind. But these particular days we're living in are a painful reminder that that's not the case with everyone. And particular when we become afraid or uncomfortable, one of the ways that we try and become less afraid and more comfortable is by centering ourselves in the equation of what should and can be. So we have people in these days refusing to wear masks and rejecting science just because it would be easier if COVID didn't exist. And we have white people determined to hang on to every ounce of privilege they can grasp. And it does feel like that cruelty knows no bounds, but at the end of the day, I'm going to choose to believe that as changeable beings, we can all be changed. And work to find within myself a willingness to believe good of me and you, and a willingness to believe in the potential of all of us, to be kind and gracious. I fully expect to continue to see lots of evidence against that proposition. But my objective in these days is to continue to be evidence for its truth. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.